So I did a little bit of investigation because, frankly, I'm not an expert on Islam. And I found a really interesting journal article by a scholar named Andrew Rippin, and I'll put a link up on nehemiaswell.com. And it's called The Muslim Samson, Medieval, Modern, and Scholarly Interpretations.
Interesting.
And he brings the Muslim sources. And what's interesting is the Quran never mentions Muhammad, or excuse me, that
Samson.
that actually might be true as well. The Quran never mentions Samson by name, but medieval Muslim interpreters, because it's a mistake to think of Islam as the religion of the Quran. This is a controversial statement that I'll make. But Islam has as much to do with the Quran as Catholicism has to do with the New Testament, and Rabbinical Judaism has to do with the Tanakh, right? There's layers and layers of interpretation and traditions on top of it, and they don't claim otherwise. So with some exceptions, right? You have Quran-only Muslims, but that's a very small minority, although there's probably more of them than there are Karaites. But still, it's, in the maybe tens of thousands of people. Okay, so the story of Samson, you're not going to find it in the Quran, but there are verses in the Quran that they interpret to be a reference to Muhammad in the Middle Ages. So there's someone named Al-Thalabi, whoever that is. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And again, this is in Rippin's article. And Al-Thalabi says, God has said, and then they quote the Quran, chapter 97, verses 1 to 3. Lo, we revealed this message, meaning, I guess, the Quran itself, on the night of power. And what will explain to you the night of power? The night of power is better than 1,000 months. No idea what that means. One of the claims about the Quran is it's the most beautiful poetry ever. That's typical of the poetry of the Quran. And maybe in the original Arabic it's more beautiful, but it sounds incoherent to me. I have no idea. Not only do I not have no idea what it's talking about, but the medieval Muslim interpreter said, what on earth is this talking about? We better make up a story to fill in the gaps. So, no, really. So what is, it says the night of power, meaning on which the Quran or some part of the Quran was revealed, is better than 1,000 months. So Abu Amr al-Iraqi told us, according to, this is still from Al-Thalabi, so some guy who was a tradition named Abu Amr al-Iraqi told us, according to his isnad, that is tradition, on the authority of Ibn Abi Najih, that the prophet mentioned a man from the children of Israel who wore armor in the way of God for 1,000 months. Right? So when the Quran says this is better than the wearing armor for 1,000 months, what does that refer to? So the medieval Muslim sources explain, well, there was an Israelite who wore armor for 1,000 months. The Muslims were amazed at that. So God revealed, that is the verse, in the Quran, lo, he revealed it on the night of power, etc., during which that man wore armor striving in the way of God. Okay, well, it still didn't tell us who this man is, right? Some Israelite wore armor for 1,000 months. Is that Samson? Well, it goes on. Abdallah Abdabah told us, this is again the Al-Thalabi, this medieval Muslim source, according to his tradition on the authority of some other guy, that Samson, whom God guided because of his righteousness, was from a Roman town whose inhabitants were idol worshippers. What? Samson was from a Roman town? Remember, the woman says in the interview with this cleric, she says, Samson the Israelite or Samson, ... Which Samson? And I thought at first he's nodding his head, but he doesn't nod his head because he's a Muslim scholar. And he doesn't believe that Samson is an Israelite.
Oh.
Samson is a Roman.
Oh.
And it goes on in this source. His story and theirs are related according to what has been told by me, by whoever, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then At-Tabari, who is another famous source of hadith, which is like the Muslim oral law. Samson was an inhabitant of one of the Roman cities. He'd been guided by God because of his integrity. However, his people were idol worshippers. From his and their story, the following has been told to us by Ibn Hamid, who reported whatever. Okay, so this is incredible. So they have a story about Samson, but it's not the story from the Tanakh. There's this these Christians and one Jew who have these talks where they talk about how, the Muslims believe in Jesus, but it's not the Jesus of the New Testament. All right, and I'm not going to get into that because it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But they have stories about Samson, and it is the Samson of the Tanakh, but what they know about the Samson of the Tanakh is completely confused, right? Bear in mind, this isn't even the Quran, right? So there's the guy who wore armor for 1,000 years or 1,000 months, and that's an Israelite, but they never say that's Samson. In the context of the man who wore armor for 1,000 years, then they tell a story about Samson. They never say directly that he's Samson, at least in what we read so far. So let me read. This is actually what the scholar did here is something interesting. He took all the different traditions and he smushed them into a single story, which is a bit dubious, but we'll read it anyway. Samson was this is the Muslim story about Samson, right? And why is this important? Because when the Lebanese Shiite cleric is talking about Samson came and he destroyed, he shattered, he left scorched earth, he knows this story. Now, it could be the Shiites have a different story. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Islam, right? I'm relying on what Ripon said here. And if somebody knows better, please post it in the comments. But this is really interesting because and a lot of things in Islam strike me as they were sitting around the campfire telling stories, and the stories kind of got confused, right? It's kind of like that game Broken Telephone. Now, they might say that, they say the same thing about us, right? In other words, in the Quran, it says that the Torah and the gospel are valid. But then when you look at the Torah that we have and when they say gospel, what do they mean? The four gospels or New Testament? Whatever they mean, that's a whole separate, discussion. Like, for example, in their traditions, it wasn't Isaac who was bound by Abraham to be sacrificed. It was Ishmael, the ancestor of Muhammad. So the point is, they have, they on the one hand acknowledge the Torah, or the Tanakh, perhaps you could say it means. On the other hand, what their stories don't match the Torah. So how do they reconcile the two? They say, well, you guys changed it. We did. So in other words, in the original Torah, they claim, some Muslims, not all, but some Muslims claim that it mentioned Muhammad and predicted the coming of Muhammad. And the Jews changed it. Anyway, so here's what it says about Samson, which is they're confused from my perspective story. And again, they might say I'm confused, but I'm willing to accept that they say that because I know I'm right. Samson was the only man among them who had submitted himself to God. And that's a technical term. Submitted himself means they're claiming he's a Muslim. So there's one Muslim in the Roman town, and that's Samson. And then Thalabi, which is really interesting, he was a Muslim among them, one of the people of the gospel. So they're saying he's not just a Christian, he's a true Christian, and a true Christian is a Muslim, right? And their distorted view of history. That's how Muslims, and again, this isn't even the Quran, this is in the Middle Ages. His mother had made him a Nazirite. He was a man from one of their villages to which the people were disbelievers who worshipped idols, right? So he's a pagan. Samson's a pagan according to the Muslim sources, right? So this Muslim cleric in 2024, a few days ago, really, he knows this story. He doesn't know what it says in the Tanakh, although the story we're about to read says nothing about fire. That he got from the Tanakh. Or did he? We'll get to that. It goes on. Samson did not live far away from them, meaning the idolaters. Alone, he used to fight them and struggle with them in the way of God, taking his needs from them while killing them, taking them prisoner and seizing their property. So this is interesting because now this is a paradigm for what a Muslim should do. You should just go steal stuff from your neighbors who aren't Muslims. That's basically that's the message here.
Wow.
Samson would encounter them only with the jawbone of a camel. So they know the story in the Tanakh, but it's been corrupted and confused. Why a camel? Because they don't know. Well, I mean, they do know about donkeys, so I don't know why a camel. But that's the way they tell the story. When they fought him and he fought them, he would work hard and become thirsty. Sweet water would burst forth from him from the rock at Lehi. So they've read the Tanakh story. They've heard it. Again, it's like sitting around the campfire, right? This is the I don't know, the TikTok version of the Tanakh story, right? It's been so confused. You're like, wait, what does it actually say in the Tanakh? Um, and he would drink, right? So it's interesting. They just described this as a repetitive action. It didn't happen once, right? He would happen and become thirsty. Sweet water would burst forth repeatedly from him from the rock at Lehi, even though it's a one-time event in the Tanakh. And he would drink from it until he was revived and had regained his strength. Neither iron nor anything else could hold him. He struggled with them in the way of God for 1,000 months. Ah, so it's not. So the one who struggled with 1,000 months isn't an Israelite. He's a pagan who comes from a Roman town. And then Tabari says, in that way he fought and battled them in the way of God, and in his raiding he would obtain his needs from them. So he comes from a pagan town, but he becomes a Christian. They were powerless before him until finally they said there is no way to get to him except through his wife. Right? So they know some of the story, but it's been confused. And look, why do they say he's a Christian? Probably because they didn't read the story of the Tanakh. They heard the story from Christian monks or Christian clerics. And so they assumed he's a Christian. The Christians told us the story, right? Now I'm speculating, I don't know. They went to his wife and bribed her. She said, yes, I will tie him up for you. So they gave her a strong rope and said, while he is sleeping, but obviously this is a retelling of this Tanakh story. While he is sleeping, bind his hand to his neck so we may come and take him away. So while he was sleeping, she bound his hand to his neck with the rope. When he awoke, he pulled it with his hand and it fell from his neck. He said to her, why have you done this? She said, I wanted to test your strength with it. I have never seen anybody like you. So she sent a message to them. I tied him with the rope, but it was of no use. So they sent her, and I don't know if I'll read the whole story. Basically, it's a retelling of what we read in Genesis. She eventually cuts his hair. And guys, you can read this in Rippon's article, which I'll put a link to. It's on page 242 if you want to hear the full Muslim story about Samson, who is a Christian who comes from a pagan family or a pagan town. So he's a convert to Christianity, right? And it's interesting, in some of the Muslim sources, this story is told within the chronological order of the man known in Christianity as Saint George. So Saint George of Lydda was a Christian martyr who was originally a Greek from Cappadocia, which is in today's central Turkey, and he was a Roman soldier who believed in Jesus. Although according to one version of the history, he might have actually been a bishop. Maybe he wasn't a Roman soldier. In any event, he was martyred by the Romans and he became Saint George. And later there's a story about Saint George and the dragon, right? He slays a dragon, but that's kind of a later elaboration of the story. So they think he's a contemporary just before or after Saint George. In other words, they think Samson is someone who lived in the 3rd century CE. Or AD. And you think, how could that be? You would think Samson lived in 3rd century AD. Well, the Quran has Haman in the court of Pharaoh. So chronology isn't their greatest strong suit. All right. It goes on. Or let me jump ahead. So his wife, who they don't name, but we know her as Delilah, she sent for the people who came and took him. They cut off his nose, and this is after she cut his hair. They cut off his nose and his earlobes, gouged out his eyes, that part's in the Tanakh, and then stood him before the people, meaning the Philistines. Well, it doesn't actually say Philistines, the Romans, I guess. And stood him before the people in front of the multi-columned minaret. So the Roman pagans have minarets. Well, I guess maybe that's where the Muslims got it from. I don't know. The people are, maybe that's what they thought Muslims got it from the Romans, I guess. I don't know. The people and their king looked down from atop it, meaning the minaret, in order to gaze at Samson and what had been done to him. And this is parallel to what you read at the end. When they mutilated him and placed him there, Samson called unto God that he be given power over them. So God ordered Samson to seize 2 of the supports of the minaret, sound familiar, on which the king, and it's interesting because in the Tanakh, they're worshiping Dagon. But here they're Roman pagans who have a minaret rather than some kind of palace. So he ordered Samson to seize, meaning God ordered Samson to seize 2 of the supports of the minaret upon which the king and the people who were looking at him were located and pull on them. So he pulled on them, and Tabari adds, God restored his sight and those things which had been removed from his body, so his ears and his nose grew back, according to Tabari's version. The
Wow.
minaret fell down along with the king and the people who were on it, and they were all killed by it in the destruction. And then Thalabi adds, his wife also perished with them. Right, that's not in the top. God restored his sight to him and made whole parts of his body, made whole the parts of his body that they had afflicted, and he returned as he had been. The story of Samson took place during the days of the petty kings, meaning the Romans. And God is all knowing, right? So this is the 3rd century AD if you put this into Muslim chronology.